Hello, good morning, and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. These are the topics that we shall be discussing today, beginning with an editorial on page number 6 of today's Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper titled Motivated Litigation. Now listen to me carefully. When Islam came to India, there are historians who say that a large number of temples were destroyed, the ruins on which some mosques were also constructed. Historians agree. What historians do not agree is what was the motivation. For example, the historians agree that Aurangzeb ordered the destruction of a large number of temples. But whether the motivation was political or religious, this is where historians disagree with each other. But we don't have to go too deep into that. We will understand this editorial by taking 3 examples. Example number 1, Ayodhya. It is argued that in 1528, on the directions of Emperor Babur, Babri Masjid was constructed in Ayodhya. But there is also a counter argument saying that this Babri Masjid was constructed after destroying a Ram temple. On the ruins of the Ram temple, Babri Masjid was constructed. And then there was a dispute, a long pending dispute. In December 1992, Babri Masjid was also demolished by the Kar Sevaks. And this case was ultimately decided by a constitution bench, by a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court in 2019, which said that this 2.77 acres of disputed land belongs to Lord Ram, and a mega Ram temple is being constructed at Ayodhya. That's number 1. But 1 year before the demolition of the Babri Masjid, a law was passed by the Parliament known as the Places of Worship Special Provisions Act 1991. According to this law, it prohibits conversion of any place of worship. For example, the cutoff date is August 15, 1947. If there was a temple on August 15, 1947, after this date, this temple cannot be converted into a mosque or vice versa. That means this law of 1991, what it does, it prohibits the conversion of any place of worship. Not just this, for example, if this was a Shia shrine belonging to Muslims, but one sect of Muslims, the Shias. If it was a Shia shrine on August 15, 1947, after this date, according to this law, this Shia shrine cannot be converted into a Sunni shrine. That means it is not only that the religious character changes, even the character related to a sect cannot change, which means a Shia shrine cannot be converted into a Sunni shrine if it existed as a Shia shrine on August 15, 1947. That means the law passed by the Parliament in 1991, known as the Places of Worship Act, what it does, it prohibits the conversion of any place of worship. And at the same time, it provides for the maintenance of the religious character. Whatever is the religious character of an institution on August 15, 1947, that religious character has to continue after that as well. But there were some areas which were kept out of the purview of this law. For example, the Ram Jannabhoomi Babri Masjid, this dispute, it was kept out of this law because the case was already pending before the court. There are also archaeological sites of religious importance, of ancient importance. They are also kept outside the purview of this law. Apart from that, all other cases will cease to exist, and you cannot change the religious character of any place of worship after 15th of August 1947. But then came the Gyan Vyapi mosque dispute. In Varanasi, where it is alleged that on the ruins of a Shiva temple, this Gyanvapi mosque was also constructed. Matter went to the court. The Muslim side argued that this petition cannot be filed because it has been barred by this law. Because the law explicitly talks about that whatever is the character of a religious institution as it exists on 15th of August 1947, it cannot be changed, it cannot be altered. But then Supreme Court said something different. Supreme Court said that this 1991 law, what it does, it prohibits the conversion of a place of worship. But what it does not talk about, the law is silent on determining the religious identity of this place. Important thing. What law does? It prohibits the conversion of any place of worship. But the law also talks about maintaining the religious character of that place of worship. But what the Supreme Court said, the law does not prohibit from inquiring into, from ascertaining what is the identity of this place of worship. That is how the Archaeological Survey of India is carrying out videography to look into the claims whether there existed a temple where Gyanvapi Mosque stands today. And the matter is to be decided by the civil court in Uttar Pradesh. The third is on Shahi Eidgah and Mathura. Shahi Eidgah Mosque, next to that there is a temple dedicated to Lord Krishna. Now the argument is that this particular Shahi Eidgah Mosque, it has been constructed on the ruins of the erstwhile temple which was dedicated to Lord Krishna. And that is how they are saying that we will have to ascertain the identity of this place of worship so that this entire land should be given to the temple authorities because it is part of the Janmsthan, the birthplace of Lord Krishna. But unlike the case of Gyanvapi, in this case the Supreme Court decided not to allow videography. Although the Allahabad High Court had asked, let's appoint a commission to inspect this mosque, to ascertain the religious identity of this place, to carry out videography, to look into the claims of the Hindu side. But the Supreme Court said this cannot be allowed. Why? Supreme Court said, number one, we have to look at maintainability of the suit. We also have to look at if such a suit is barred from law. And then there can be claims. The Supreme Court has invoked some technicality. For example, you are filing a case before the court saying I should be allowed to participate in the civil services examination. That is the provisional relief that you want from the court because the UPSC says you are not allowed, you are not eligible to write the exam. You are asking the court that we will discuss the eligibility slightly later, but first allow me to enter in the examination hall, participate in this examination. That is the provisional relief that I'm seeking. Once the examination is done, then you can decide whether I was eligible or not. Because if I was eligible, but you did not allow me to write the exam, I will lose out on an important year. The claims of the Hindu side was, let's have a videography and then we will determine whether this was a Hindu site or a Muslim site. The court said, you cannot give this relief, provisional relief, unless and until you determine whether this suit is maintainable or not. Unless and until you can convince us that such a case can be filed, because we think that this is barred by the 1991 law. Because the 1991 law, the Places of Worship Act, it prohibits the conversion of any place of worship, which means the identity of a religious worship place as it existed on 15th of August 1947, it cannot be altered after that. And this editorial basically says that courts should not be allowed to convert places of worship. That means if there is already a law which prohibits the conversion of any place of worship, you should not be taking the route of the court to dilute this law. In fact, there is a petition filed in the Supreme Court challenging this 1991 law as well. The petitioners claim that this law is arbitrary. How can you decide on a date? Why is 15th August 1947 declared as a cut-off date? This date is arbitrary, and a law cannot be arbitrary. That's ground number one. Ground number two, it violates judicial review. Because you are basically saying through this law that the courts cannot interfere in matters related to religious places of worship, which basically means you are violating judicial review, which is part of the basic structure of the Constitution. And it also violates Article 25 of the Constitution, which gives fundamental right to any person living in India from practicing, professing, and propagating his or her religion. Whatever will be the outcome of this case will be decided in due course of time, and we will have an elaborate discussion once that judgment is delivered by the court. But here, to summarize, motivated litigation, an editorial on page number 8 in Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper, it basically says the crux of the editorial is that the court should put an end to the conversion of any religious place of worship, because it is not allowed by the 1991 Places of Worship Act. Clear? Let's look at another editorial, smaller citizens. And this is something that we discussed yesterday as well, but I will take a different route today, different dimension to this editorial today. For example, the ASER Study. Released by a civil society organization, Pratham, which we discussed yesterday, it says that the enrollment of children has increased. There is a transition of students from elementary to secondary education. That means more and more students are crossing standard 9, standard 10, so the enrollment has gone up. In fact, today children have more years of schooling than they ever had. But this ASER study also points out to some deficiencies, in the sense that those who are in standard 5, they are unable to read a text in their mother tongue belonging to the standard 2. The arithmetic ability is also taking a hit. Simple division is not able to be understood and comprehended by the students. They should have been proficient in arithmetic skills by standard 3 or 4 or maximum 5, and a student who is in the age group of 14 to 18, they are unable to even solve these simple arithmetic problems. But at the same time, we will look at the child labor law. Why? Because the ASER study talks about that the students are facing acute competition, they are under a lot of stress, and this stress is not only visible on the faces of the urban students, but also on the faces of the rural students, because they have to juggle between school and working in the farms, because the child labor law allows them to work for their family business after the school hours. And for that, we will look at this child labor law. But before we do that, there was a child labor law passed in the year 1986. What it did, it talked about prohibition. It also talked about regulation. This law only talked about children less than the age of 14 years. So who is a child less than the age of 14 years according to this law? And these children are prohibited from working in hazardous occupations. Where there is a danger to their survival. For example, they cannot work in hazardous occupations such as in brick kilns, such as in deep sea diving, such as in construction industry. But the children less than the age of 14 could have worked in non-hazardous occupations. Which means a child less than the age of 14 can work at a roadside dhaba, can work as a domestic maid as well. Analysts, critics, commentators argued that this particular law is incompatible with Article 21 capital A of the Constitution, which talks about a fundamental right to all children in the age group of 6 to 14 that you have a fundamental right to primary education. So if for children up to the age of 14 there is a fundamental right to primary education, how can we allow such children to work in non-hazardous occupations? So this law is basically incompatible with Article 21 capital A of the Constitution, which is a fundamental right. To make this law better, this law was amended in the year 2016. What this amended law now says, children less than the age of 14 cannot work, whether in hazardous occupations or non-hazardous occupations. Children less than the age of 14 cannot be employed, and it is a crime to employ these children, except they can work in audio-visual entertainment industry, and they can work in family business. But they can work in audio-visual entertainment industry, for example, as child artists. They can work in the family enterprises, family businesses as well, but only after school hours or during vacation. And now for the first time, this law is also talking about adolescents. And who are these adolescents? In the age group of 14 to 18. These adolescents, they cannot work in hazardous industries, but these adolescents can work in non-hazardous occupations. Isn't this a better improvement, better law than the law of 1986? Because 1986 law prohibited the employment of children in hazardous occupations, but these children could have been allowed to work in non-hazardous occupations. And this law did not talk about adolescents in the age group of 14 to 18. Now this is a better law because this law prohibits the employment of children less than the age of 14 in all occupations, whether hazardous or non-hazardous, except during school, after school hours or during vacation. These children can work in audio-visual entertainment industry, can work in family enterprises. And now for the first time, the law is talking about children in the age group of 14 to 18. The law calls them adolescents, and these adolescents cannot work in hazardous occupations, but they can be employed in non-hazardous occupations. So there are critics who say this is a better law, a better improved version of the 1986 law. But there are others who say this law, this child labor law which was amended in 2016, it basically allows child labor. How does it allow child labor? Listen to me carefully. Number one, this law does not define the hours of work. If a child less than the age of 14 can work after the school hours or during vacation in audio-visual entertainment industry, in family enterprises, but after school hours, during vacation, for how many hours, what would be the duration of these hours of work, that is not defined in this law. And at the same time, this law is tilted against a girl child. Unfortunately, in India, we do not value a girl child. The girl child is killed inside the womb of her mother. If somehow she survives, but then she is discriminated against by the society, by the family as well. The male child is given nutritious food, but the female child, unfortunately, is not. Imagine the burden on this female child who has to participate in the school activities during the day. After that, she has to help her mother in the family business or help her father in the family business, despite the fact that she is not given nutritious food. Where is the stamina going to come from when she has to work in the school, study in the school, then work for the family business? How will she get the stamina to get up early in the morning and join the classes again? That means it does not define the hours of work. That is one problem. Another problem is occupations in India, particularly when it comes to child labor, they are caste-based occupations. So if you are allowing a child to work and help the family business, this family business is basically caste-based when it comes to child labor. For example, the family business of a child, the father of a child he's a cobbler, caste-based. And unfortunately, the members of the so-called untouchable classes, they are the cobblers. So if you're allowing these children to work in the family business, it basically means you're perpetuating the caste-based occupation in this country. That's another problem. A bigger problem is when we say that these adolescents cannot work in hazardous industry, but they can be employed in non-hazardous occupations. Do you know what has happened in 2016? Previously, there used to be 83 occupations listed as hazardous. There used to be 83 occupations listed as hazardous. After 2016, the number of hazardous occupations have been reduced to 3. That means in 80 occupations, adolescents can still be allowed to work. Although these are also hazardous, but we don't call them hazardous because we have removed them from the list of hazardous occupations. Which basically means in chemical mixing units, in brick kilns, these adolescents are allowed to work because we have no longer categorized them as hazardous occupations. That's not the only problem. This number, 3, can be reduced to 2, then to 1, then to 0. Not by the parliament, but by the government officials. That means if there were 83 occupations listed as hazardous prior to 2016, after 2016, we have reduced this number from 83 to 3. This list can be further reduced to 2, to 1, to 0, saying there are no hazardous occupations in India. And this can be done not by the parliament, but by the government officials on their own. Which means legislature will not have an oversight on reducing the number of hazardous occupations. That is why critics say this 2016 law, it does not prohibit child labor, it basically allows child labor. So this child labor law, along with Right to Education Act of 2009, along with the ASER report, along with the new National Education Policy of 2020, all these important things you will have to link together. That is how you can prepare for the civil services examination. Clear? Let's look at another column written by a 3-time Member of the Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, Lok Sabha constituency, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Beleaguered Indian media, quo vadis, which basically means where are you headed? It's a Latin term which means where are you headed? We are not talking about social media. It comes with its own set of problems. We are not talking about print media either in this column. We are talking about electronic media, the TV news channels. Press plays a very important role. Media plays a very important role. And that is why we call media the 4th pillar of democracy. If there is legislature, there is executive, there is judiciary, these are the 3 pillars. The 4th pillar is the media. And the job of the media is to hold government accountable. Government is normally held accountable by the legislature. For example, the Council of Ministers are directly accountable to Lok Sabha. That is why we call India a parliamentary democracy, where the Council of Ministers, headed by the Prime Minister, is accountable to the lower house of Indian Parliament, which is the Lok Sabha. But this government, which is held accountable by the legislature through motions, resolutions, through no confidence motion, through confidence motion, through debates, discussions and questions, this government is also held accountable by the media. So media should ask uncomfortable questions to the government, questioning the various policies of the government, questioning the foreign policy, economic policy, domestic policy, security policy. That is how we can become an aware society. Previously, there was a time when we had only Doordarshan and All India Radio, controlled by the government. Will these entities controlled by the government be able to hold the government accountable? No. There used to be BBC. But in 1970, 2 documentaries were broadcast by BBC, and BBC was expelled from India for 2 years. In 1975, when Srimati Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, when emergency was imposed in this country, BBC was expelled again. But then came the 1991 reforms, liberalization, privatization, globalization. That is how a lot of investment was made into the private electronic media, and that is how the number of electronic media channels have mushroomed over the past many years. But Dr. Shashi Tharoor says this electronic media is facing a lot of challenges and problems. And we can break down all these challenges into various heads. One is sensationalism. Where do these TV channels get their revenue from? Basically from the advertisements. And how does a television channel get more advertisement, more ad revenue? If more number of people are watching their programs and shows, which is what we call TRP, television rating points. Higher the TRP, higher the ad revenue that a news channel generates. And how do they catch the eyeballs? By sensationalizing the news. Taimur Ali Khan calls Abba for the first time. That's the breaking news. Sensationalism is one problem, which basically means some important news articles are sidelined in favor of sensationalism. Second, paid news. I am a member of a parliament belonging to a particular constituency. I pay money to an electronic media channel. You publish and broadcast good stories about the kind of work that I have done in my constituency. And these gullible people, my voters, they would feel that since this fourth pillar of democracy, an independent media channel is broadcasting good things about this MP, basically he has done good for us. That's another problem, paid news. Fake news, another menace, another problem that electronic media channels are facing. Trial by media. Dr. Shashi Tharoor says, previously we used to have Agni Pariksha. Now we have trial by media. The media decides who is guilty and who is not. There is a golden rule of criminal justice system, which is you are innocent until proven otherwise. You are innocent until you are proven guilty. But media every night, 9 o'clock declares I am guilty or you are guilty or some other individual is guilty. Trial by media, not by the judges, trial by media. And the bigger problem is ownership. There are few select corporate houses which control almost the entire media in this country. This gives a sense of some kind of oligarchy that is present in India, where few business houses are controlling all these important media institutions. Lack of diversity. Who are these editors, top journalists in this country? Do they belong to a particular caste group? That's what some people allege. They all come from the upper, so-called upper castes of the society, which means even in the media management houses, there is lack of diversity. And over the past many years, we are seeing that media is also an instigator. It instigates riots, drives a wedge between communities, between different classes, different regions as well. And these are the problems, big problems, that electronic media is facing right now. Then what is the solution? This topic becomes very important for your essay. Solution prescribed by Dr. Shashi Tharoor is, number one, first we must engender a culture of fact verification and accuracy that the industry currently appears to lack. Under the garb of TRPs, chasing television rating points, we just publish and broadcast news, breaking news, without verifying whether this news is true or not. So hold your news, hold your accusations, unless and until you have checked them, fact-checked them. That's how, after that, after you have fact-checked them, you can broadcast that news article. That's number one. Number two, we must insist on better journalistic training. In journalism schools, journalists are taught 5 W's and 1 H. If you have to broadcast a story, ask questions. What is the story? Why is the story important? How is the story relevant? Who are the people involved? Where did this event happen? And at the same time, journalists are told, show, don't tell. But at the same time, these journalists at the journalism schools, they should be given training to ensure that they are men and women of ethics. Unless and until they verify a news article, they verify an accusation, they should not be broadcasting that story. So that is the level of training that we have to impart to these important journalists who act as the fourth pillar of the democracy. Issue retractions with equal prominence. For example, the son of a Bollywood superstar has been arrested under Narcotics, Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. So this person is a drug addict. This was flashed by almost all the news channels. But when it came to the reality that this person may not have been involved, they did not issue retractions. They did not apologize. Or even if some media channels apologized, but they apologized at a location where it was not visible to the viewer. That means they just issued a notification that we are sorry for this. But the manner in which they projected this young boy as a drug addict every morning, every evening, in the same prominence, these news channels did not retract their stories. So Dr. Shashi Tharoor says you need to issue retractions whenever you come across a fact wherein you had projected it as a lie. You need to retract it with equal prominence. Third, we must welcome different perspectives in our newsrooms and not allow them to become echo chambers, forcing an opinion onto their viewers. For example, every evening, 9 o'clock, the chief priest of media says the nation wants to know. It's not the nation who wants to know. It is the anchor who wants to know. So basically putting his own views onto the viewers. We need a diversity of opinions. Let's have quality debates in the media channels. For example, there should be a debate on whether we should have a universal basic income or not. Have few guests who will say we need a universal basic income. Have some guests who will oppose universal basic income. Let's address these issues in a well debated and in a gentleman's agreement, without the anchor forcing his own views onto the viewer. Not just that, journalists must welcome comments and feedback from their viewers and readers. For example, the Hindu newspaper, till a couple of years ago, used to have a reader's editor. Who would act as a bridge between the reader and the editor, between the reader and the publisher of the newspaper. In a similar fashion, these electronic media channels should encourage the viewers to give their own feedback and possibly present their own point of view. That's how we can build this trust between the viewer and the news media. Not just that, the government must introduce laws. This is a very important point, because today there are few select corporate houses which dominate the electronic media industry. Dr. Shashi Tharoor says the government must introduce laws and regulations that limit the control of multiple news organizations by a single business house. So a single business house is dominating multiple news channels and media organizations. That should not be allowed to happen, because then free press, which is our fundamental right, gets diluted. And finally, we have different regulators. For press, newspapers, we have Press Council of India. For electronic media channels, we have National Broadcasting Standards Authority, different regulators. Dr. Shashi Tharoor says we need a single regulator, single overseer for both print as well as electronic media. And this is suggested by Telecom Regulatory Authority as well. This is suggested by the Parliamentary Committee on Information Technology Act, Information Technology as well, of which Dr. Shashi Tharoor was the chairperson. If these suggestions are incorporated, we can see that there will be a sea of change in the way news media or electronic media is disseminating information, and we will see a huge change in the way people will repose their trust in the electronic media. That's what you need to understand from this column. Now let's look at another news article. US hits Yemen after Houthis are redesignated as terrorists. In yesterday's newspaper analysis, I told you that Houthis once were designated as terrorists, but they were removed from that list later on. And now yesterday, the United States has redesignated Houthis as terrorists. But from the prelims perspective, you need to understand a distinction. What is the distinction? Houthis have been designated as specially designated global terrorist group and not a foreign terrorist organization. What is the difference? Some examples of foreign terrorist organization: Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hizbul Mujahideen, Indian Mujahideen, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hamas, Hezbollah, the organizations we discussed yesterday. All these are designated as foreign terrorist organization. But Houthis have been designated as specially designated global terrorist group and not a foreign terrorist group. What is the difference? If you are designated as a specially designated global terrorist group, it is basically to control, limit funds to this organization. Basically to choke the financials of this terrorist organization, you are designating it as specially designated global terrorist group. But if you were declared as a foreign terrorist organization, there are three implications. Implication number one, members are inadmissible to United States. Members of this foreign terrorist organization, they cannot enter United States. They are inadmissible. That's challenge. That is implication number one. Implication number two, it's a crime to provide material resources, support to this terrorist organization. So any individual or any organization, if it basically supports or provides material assistance to this organization, it's a crime. Which basically means banks, insurers, the companies worldwide, they cannot deal with these foreign terrorist organizations. And third implication is victims. Those who are the victims of these foreign terrorist organizations, they are allowed to file civil suits in United States of America. basically to claim compensation because they are the victims of these foreign terrorist organizations. So if Hamas and Hezbollah, these are foreign terrorist organizations, it basically means no bank, no insurer, no world company can deal with these organizations. Whoever is a member of these organizations will not be allowed to enter United States. And in United States, the victims of these organizations, they are also eligible to file civil suits. These are not the implications for Houthis, because this Houthi group is not designated as a foreign terrorist group or a foreign terrorist organization, but has been designated as a specially designated global terrorist group, which basically means only the funding needs to be choked, only the financial assistance needs to be choked. And there are critics who say it won't matter to Houthis as well, because Houthis, they do not operate overseas. Houthis, they are not part of the United States financial system, so it won't matter to Houthis. It would have mattered to Houthis if they would have been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. But that's the difference between the two. Can be relevant for your prelims examination. Let's look at another important article. China, Philippines agreed to ease tensions. China is an expansionist state. It wants to expand its territory. If you look at this map, China basically claims almost the entire South China Sea. And this is where it is engaged in disputes with its neighbors as well. Specifically, we are talking about Philippines. And specifically, this dispute is around Second Thomas Shoal. What is a shoal? As a student of geography, you would know that it's basically a sandbar just beneath the surface of the water, just beneath the surface of the water level. It's basically an obstruction, which basically makes navigation very difficult. So it's like a sandbar or a sand bank just beneath the surface of the water. This Second Thomas Shoal is the term given to it by United States. China basically calls it Renai Reef. Philippines calls it Ayungin Shoal. But United States calls it Second Thomas Shoal. This is a dispute between Philippines and China. Philippines claims that China wants to establish a military base here, just like China established a military base in the Mischief Reef. Mischief Reef is 25 miles away from Second Thomas Shoal. Now, there is some sort of an agreement between Philippines and China wherein they say that we will manage the situation, we will talk to each other, we will restore our diplomatic relations to come to some sort of a solution on the Renai Reef or the Second Thomas Shoal. So this can be asked in your prelims examination. Second Thomas Shoal is a dispute between which of the following countries? That is what it becomes important for your prelims exam. Now towards the end, two questions, one for your GS, the other essay paper. GS question number 1, artisans should be hired as teachers to pass on traditional knowledge and skills to the next generation. Comment. For example, the criticism of the Child Labour Act of 2016 was that the children less than the age of 14, they can work in their family business. The argument was that if the family is engaging in some art forms, for example, handicrafts, for example, carpet weaving, for example, paper mache industry, this is basically a skill which should be passed through generations and generations. Basically, the grandfather will pass it on to his son or daughters, then it will pass on through the entire generation, because this craft needs to be preserved, this artistry needs to be preserved. That is why the government says we are allowing child to work in the family business after school hours or during vacation, so that we can preserve that art form, we can preserve that craft. Critics argue that if you really want to preserve this craft, why don't you hire these artisans as teachers? So that this skill is imparted not only to their own family members, but to the wider audience as well, to the wider society as well, so that we preserve all these artistic forms. That is why the question, artisans should be hired as teachers to pass on traditional knowledge and skills to the next generation. Comment in 250 words. And the essay topic, those who live by the media sword, die by the media sword. Those who are created by the media, ultimately they are killed by the media as well. That is it from our discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper. If you have liked the session, if you got some benefit out of this session, please do not forget to press the like button, drop in your comments, subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet, and share the links of these classes with your friends and fellow aspirants. Thank you so much for staying with me. See you again tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning, with another edition of the Hindu newspaper analysis. Bye-bye. Take care.